Hello, boils and ghouls, and welcome to Horror Beneath the Surface, the podcast that takes a deep dive into horror films, novels, and television shows. Each episode going beneath the surface, examining the themes, messages, and viscera of the horror genre as a whole. I am your host, Professor Terror, otherwise known as Mark. This week on Horror Beneath the Surface, Part 1, the 90's, A Golden Age of Kids Horror, Act 1, The Morgue. Here we dissect an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark, as well as explore the history of the show and some facts about it. Act 2, The Eulogy, we discuss children's horror novel series Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, as well as Scary Stories for Sleepovers, Goosebumps, and some other horror novels for children at the time. Act 3, The Mausoleum, we look into the stars and guests of the 90's teen horror show Are You Afraid of the Dark, from the famous names to those that would become so later. Stick around. This episode of Horror Beneath the Surface is sponsored by Pine Tree Audio. Pine Tree Audio, the finest quality audio cables and devices for audiophiles and hobbyists alike. Are you in need of a passive preamp, speaker selector, power supplies and filters, speakers, power cables, audio cables, and more? I know I am. Pine Tree Audio. Ultra-high performance audio cables and devices, accept nothing less. 100% handmade in America. Visit Pine Tree Audio on the web for more information. Act 1, The Morgue. It's Saturday night in the 90's, and you're a pre-teen or a teen. School is a distant memory as you are riding high on the weekend. Other networks had their must-see TV and TGIF lineups, but for Nickelodeon and 90's kids, it was Snick. You had shows like Pete and Pete, Clarissa Explains It All, Keenan and Kel, and all that, among others. But one show stood out from the rest. Are You Afraid of the Dark? Aimed at 11, 12-year-olds and teens, Are You Afraid of the Dark was an anthology show about a group of kids who met at night and told each other scary stories around a campfire. Stories that they themselves had made up during the week. Are You Afraid of the Dark was a Canadian-made television production that would find a home on Nickelodeon. In order to avoid censors and other standards and practices entanglements, they would often make modern adaptations to classic horror stories like The Monkey's Paw, first published in 1902, or riffs on The Twilight Zone. That story was turned into The Tale of the Twisted Claw and follows most of the same story themes and beats against an updated and modern story. This approach gave the show an air of educational content that helped the show avoid censorship and gave it a educational sheen, if you will. The kids telling these stories were all different personality-wise, but ultimately relatable to the viewer. You had Gary, who was more of a nerdy type, Kiki the tomboy, Frank the tough guy, Betty Ann the quirky girl, Tucker the prankster, little brother of Gary, Sam the sporty girl, and Kirsten the more standard girly girl type, for lack of a better term. These kids didn't seem like stereotypes and weren't written with a specific agenda in mind. They were simply characters who felt realistic and relatable. They would also tell stories of kids in horror story situations who were also going through relatable problems. Things like trying to fit in as the new kid, conquering a phobia, or the importance of honesty were common themes in the stories, alongside horrific monsters and terrifying situations. And that's why I want to discuss this show. At times, this show would and could be very scary. A lot of children's horror content is mandated to have a happy ending where everything works out and no one was ever really in danger. Maybe it was all just a dream. But Are You Afraid of the Dark said, absolutely not. We're a horror TV show that does not pull its punches. The show featured numerous endings with ambiguous ends, and implications that the evil might not have been vanquished after all. To this day, if you ask a 90's kid about the show, they will have some memory of an episode that terrified them. Most of the time, for female viewers I've asked, it tends to be the episode The Tale of the Dollhouse. The idea of a teen tween girl being trapped behind a secret door and slowly being turned into a giant living porcelain doll at the same time as falling apart really seems to have messed with a generation of younger women. As for males, a popular and disturbing episode that seared its way into the brain seems to be The Tale of the Dead Man's Float, which is what is undoubtedly the best monster costume in the show. A sinewy, red, decaying corpse that tries to drown children in a pool. Like I said, this show did not pull its punches. Coincidentally, Dead Man's Float was an episode that stayed with me as a kid, for sure. Today I want to discuss one of the darker episodes of Are You Afraid of the Dark, Season 1, Episode 11, The Tale of the Dark Music. The opening credits for this show are pitch perfect along with some great atmospheric music. I can remember feeling a bit of tension in my stomach watching it as a kid, even though I loved the show. The credits encapsulate the show and its tone perfectly, scary and mature without being overtly horrifying. The show and its production is always in service of what each tale told needs. Nothing more, nothing less. We see a boat tied up rocking in the waves on a deserted, foggy, moonlit beach, an empty swing set swaying in an empty park, rain-drenched shutters clapping against a window in a thunderstorm, an attic filled with odd items including a porcelain clown statue, an old metal fan, shafts of light behind and through a keyhole in a closed door. A match is lit, illuminating the title of the show. The flame is snuffed out, darkness falls, the show is about to begin. All the opening credit images are amazing and fantastic. It's interesting to think that in the daytime these images are fairly commonplace. Thunderstorms, rain, fans, swing sets swaying in an empty park, but set against the darkness of the night in shafts of light, these images conjure a lot more fear and terror than they would during the day. We start off with Frank mad at Eric for leaving him behind on the way to the campfire, and we find out that Frank's afraid of the dark. The other members tease him because it goes against his tough guy persona. Eric begins his story by spreading the dust over the fire, causing it to flare, and begins. A kid named Andy, whose parents' divorce has recently led to a relocation to a new town. Things were tough for Andy. His sister and his single mom. Andy runs a paper route in order to buy himself lunch at school and help out with the rest of the family's expenses. The family's luck seemed to have changed for the better, though, when his mom inherits an old house from an estranged hermetic uncle. While moving in, Andy in no time becomes target for a local bully. Andy's uncle was weird and reclusive, so the town allegedly did not like him and was glad when he died, according to the bully. Andy is guilty by association of being in the same family as the uncle, and so the bully hates him as well. Bullies will pick any reason to hate somebody. Andy is afraid of the dark, and when his mom asks him to go into the basement, he's reluctant. There's a switch at the top of the stairs in the new house that turns the power to the basement on or off. I have no idea why they have this kind of switch in the show, but they do. Andy makes sure he has power and light down there and goes down. The basement is full of old junk and has a creepy vibe. Andy finds an old radio from the 40s and plugs it in. Behind him is a strange room with an old wooden door that starts to rattle and creak. The door opens itself, revealing glowing red eyes peering out of the darkness. A creepy, but also kind of soothing voice, think Pennywise in the infamous Georgie scene, says, "Hello, Andy, come on in." And Andy understandably freaks out and knocks over the radio, breaking it while running upstairs. His mom comes down with a hockey stick to investigate. The room is nothing more than an old root cellar with nothing in it. She's convinced he saw a rat or something. Andy isn't so sure, but doesn't seem as scared anymore. Meanwhile, things seem to go back to normal. Andy runs afoul of the bully on his paper route. A chase ensues, but he manages to hide in his basement to avoid getting beaten to a pulp. His relief is short-lived as he soon finds himself in the dark and in the basement. He looks around. He is startled by his little sister who jumps out and scares him and begins teasing him about being afraid. Side note, eagle-eyed viewers will be able to spot a severed hand in a jar just casually hanging out in the background. It doesn't feature in the plot, nor is it even mentioned. It is Dr. Vink's severed hand from the episode Tale of the Phantom Cab. Yep, Dr. Vink's hand, just sitting on a shelf. Nothing weird here. Later that evening, Andy asks his mother about the strange uncle who willed the house to them. She mentions that he was somehow well off despite never ever leaving the house much, and, like the bully told us earlier, the neighbors didn't care for him. I do love this episode, but will never understand how neighbors could hate the uncle so much if he never left the house. I mean, they might have thought he was snobby, but if he never interacted with them, I can't see how they could actively dislike him as much as they seem to. The uncle died of old age, and Mom blurts out that he was found dead in the basement. Great play, Ma. She quickly changes the subject by immediately asking Andy's little sister to go into the basement to switch the laundry over. Probably not the best timing. Hey son, remember that creepy uncle that no one liked? Yeah, he died in the basement under mysterious circumstances. Anyway, that laundry ain't gonna do itself. Little sister decides she doesn't want to. She is playing a video game, and seeing how this is the early 90s, most likely she's playing Mario 3. As much as shirking her responsibilities off to her brother or douchey, it's understandable. Super Mario 3 is just so great. In the basement, Andy is switching over the laundry while listening to the radio. The root cellar door begins to rattle. Andy turns around to see a giant life-size China doll walking out of the root cellar at him. It says, "Hi, Andy. Won't you come play with me?" in a creepy little kid voice, all the while walking closer to him. Wait a minute. An evil talking doll and a boy named Andy? This seems somehow familiar. Toy Story or Child's Play? I don't know. The doll wants him to go into the root cellar. Perfectly reasonable. He seems hypnotized and almost goes into the root cellar with her when his mom turns off the power to the basement and the doll is sucked back into the root cellar where the door closes. Andy doesn't seem to remember any of this when his mom calls down to him. The next day, back in the basement with laundry, this family sure has a lot of laundry, and another shot of the severed hand that no one is going to acknowledge, carnival music starts playing on the radio. The door opens, and Andy sees through the door a carnival and a carnival barker beckoning him into the root cellar. At no point is there discussion of if they float in the root cellar, but it wouldn't be out of place here if they did. The carnival barker turns into a skeleton and grabs Andy's hand, trying to take him into the root cellar. He tries to run away as he is being sucked into the root cellar, grabbing anything he can to avoid being sucked in. He grabs the radio, which he unplugs. The root cellar door immediately shuts, and all is quiet. Andy has an epiphany. Music triggers the door. He turns the music back on, and the door begins to jiggle and tries to open. He shuts off the music and takes off to find his mom to tell her about the root cellar. He shortly runs into his bully, who punches him in the face and throws his bike into the road to be run over by a giant truck. The bike is totaled, and Andy no longer has an effective way to run his paper route and help make extra money. Discouraged, Andy goes home and is struck with an idea. He goes to the basement and brings the family's giant stereo down. He sets it up and cranks the volume knob. He also locks the upstairs door. Wrapping a brick in a newspaper, Andy pays a visit to his bully. He pelts the bully in the face with the newspaper brick and taunts him. Andy runs away with the bully in chase and lures him into the basement of his house. Once the bully is in, Andy locks the bulkhead doors from outside where he was hiding, out of sight. The bully is now trapped in the basement. Andy then throws the power switch to the basement from the upstairs. Heavy metal blares from the stereo, and the bully covers his ears, screaming. The door begins to rattle and opens, glowing red. The bully screams some more. Andy turns off the music and descends the stairs. Andy had intended on scaring the bully, but does not find him in the basement. He instead finds a new bike sitting in the basement. He turns on the music again, and the door opens. A voice from the root cellar tells him that the bike is a gift, and that as long as Andy feeds the root cellar, he can have anything he wants. His uncle had a similar arrangement with the root cellar, which is how and why he got so rich. Andy hears his bratty sister upstairs and begins to grin menacingly. The story ends. The members of the Midnight Society compliment Eric on his story and pour water on the fire. Frank has disappeared with Eric's father's flashlight and left him in the dark, where Eric has second thoughts about how scary the dark can be. Frank jumps out and scares him, and they both run off home. There's a ton of great stuff in this episode. First off, it has some really effective imagery in it. As simple as it is, the red eyes in the darkness calling to Andy totally works. It's creepy. Even rewatching it today, it still has a creep factor despite having seen the red eyes in the darkness play out countless times in films and television. The skeleton that grabs Andy is probably the weakest of the root cellar's manifestations, but overall is still fun, albeit slightly campy effect. I will say, however, that the carnival sequence that preceded it was more effective on rewatch than I thought it would be. Looking through the doorway at the carnival, the picture isn't straight on, it's tilted oddly, giving it an eeriness that hints at its true malevolent nature. This reminds me a lot of a scene in the 1990 TV movie for Stephen King's It. Ben Hanscom goes down to the Barrens on his own where he's called by his deceased father. He looks up to see his father standing on the swamp water near the entrance to the sewers holding balloons, beckoning Ben to come to him. He slowly turns into a clown, and then a skeleton shoots out of the water trying to grab him. I wonder if the success and popularity of the TV movie inspired some of the visual and horror elements of this episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? The highlight of this episode, and without a doubt the most terrifying element, is the giant China doll. Suddenly there, with an expressionless pale face, it speaks in a creepy childlike voice. It only wants to play, or so it says. The costume is extremely effective and looks just like a giant doll that's trying to kill you would. This is also another one of the images burned into the brains of millennials that usually comes up when reminiscing about the show. This episode has a lot of genuinely scary and creepy moments that it doesn't shy away from. Just the setup alone is effective in being off-putting. Somehow rich reclusive man dies in his house. Andy finds that the house has a demonic-type portal in the basement that eats people. Eventually the house eats and kills the bully. It is implied at the end that Andy is considering feeding his sister to the house. In the scenes at the end with the kids and the campfire, it is said that he only uses it to scare her and does not feed her to it. All of this is, again, part of a tween horror show. I find it hard to believe that this kind of thing would fly today. We as an audience never get an explanation as to what exactly the monster house is or why it demands sacrifice, and we don't need to. It's the unknown that makes it scary. Andy is the proxy for the audience. We are following him. We know what he knows. He has no plausible way of finding out information about the house. A rather unfortunate trend in movies and television in the last few years is the need to over-explain everything. There is nothing we as an audience don't know or that isn't explained to the nth degree. There's no mystery anymore. The story is heightened because we only know what we need to know. The unknown is always scarier than the known. Part of the strength of Are You Afraid of the Dark is that it didn't talk down to its audience. It simply wanted to tell scary stories and be relatable. Andy is a relatable character in a number of ways, without being contrived or stereotypical. He's afraid of the dark, he has a paper route, bully, he's the new kid in town. All of these things are broadly experienced by kids, whether it be one of them, all of them, some of them. Whether it's going to a new school, moving, having a bully, a bratty sibling, it's easy to relate to Andy as well as the kids in the Midnight Society. At the same time, the show always strives to tell the best possible story, letting nothing get in the way and not trying to coddle the viewer. At no point are they trying to push a narrative or some kind of contrived thing. They're really just trying to tell a scary story and be entertaining as well as relatable. The tension, the fear, and danger are real in a lot of episodes. The bully is eaten by the house and is gone. It wasn't just a nightmare at the end, Andy's imagination. We don't actually see anything other than him screaming and then disappearing, which is how I imagine they got away with killing the bully. However, just the fact that they had the guts to go for the jugular just proves how uncompromising this show was. Aside from Stranger Things, which had the benefit of not having to make it on cable or network television, horrors involving children and teens had practically been non-existent, with a couple of outliers such as R.L. Stine's The Haunting Hour, Goosebumps, etc. I'm not saying that Are You Afraid of the Dark did not have happy endings, or was always, a pedal-to-the-floor horror show. It wasn't. There were several episodes dealing with ghosts or folks with unfinished business connected to the afterlife or supernatural, like the Tale of the Hungry Hounds, Tale of the Frozen Ghost, or the Tale of Apartment 214. Other episodes would feature aliens, such as the Tale of the Visitor or the Tale of the 13th Floor. If the episode warranted a happy ending, it usually got one. If it warranted a twist, then we got one of those too. In the case of the Tale of the Dark music, we got a dark ending of a dark story. Act 2, The Eulogy. Children's horror had a renaissance in the 90s with shows like Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark, and the animated Tales from the Crypt Keeper pushing the envelope for kids' TV horror. The shows, however, had a predecessor and a few contemporaries in the world of literature. Mention the Scholastic Book Fair to any millennial and you'll be greeted with memories of rolling into the school store and leaving with a fistful of kids' horror novels. Or at least, that's how it was for me. From Goosebumps to Scary Stories to Tell at Sleepovers, Bunnicula, The Witches by Roald Dahl, and even My Teacher is an Alien, the fair did not shy away from offering dark fantasy or horror novels alongside books about sporty kids, loyal pets, and the Animorphs. The Goosebumps series by writer R.L. Stine had wonderful covers illustrated by Tim Jacobus. It featured evil dummies, haunted houses, mummies, vampires, ghosts, evil snowmen, scarecrows, and a lot of gooey slime. Basically everything a child horror fan could want and more. Or even an adult horror fan, let's be real. As a child horror fan who had no interest in sports, the Goosebumps novel's popularity was one of the only popular trends at the time that swept me up in it. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, first published in 1981, was written by author Alvin Schwartz. Schwartz was a reporter in his early life with a penchant for research. Eventually he began writing books aimed at the children's market. These books were folk tales and joke books, as well as books about superstitions. Some books sold better than others, and Schwartz, from a career standpoint, mostly lived off advances and always working on the next book, never knowing whether the next book would be a hit or not. It was eventually suggested to him that he begin working on a book of children's horror stories. Scary Stories in the Dark was the first book in a series featuring updated and adapted horror stories from all over the world. These tales were meticulously researched and adapted by Schwartz. He would keep the essence and the moral of the story and simply update in order to make them palatable and relevant to a younger and more modern audience. In addition to this, the book featured information on the origins of all the stories within, such as country of origin, where they were collected from, and so on. So not only do we have a book of children's horror stories, but a sort of cultural anthropology study for kids. If you were a kid that just wanted a good scare or to read a gnarly horror story, this book had everything you wanted. But if you were a kid with more curiosity, you would get a horror story and the history and tradition of these tales. It was a win-win. Some of these stories went back hundreds of years, and yet others only went back decades. It shows that folk tales are a common thread in the human experience. From the lover's ghost to Slender Man, mankind's need for scary stories is eternal. The original book came out in 81, with a sequel following in 84, and a third in 91. The stories in the collections were relatable and usually had morals or lessons to caution against certain behavior or explain and explore a more common human experience. Let's take a look at one story from the collection that should be familiar to you, whether you've read it or not. A teenage couple decides to go on a date. They go and eventually decide to go find a place to park and make out. They find a secluded area, turn on the radio, and begin the makeout session. However, it is interrupted by a radio news flash warning the public of an escaped mental patient with a hook for a hand. He was last spotted in the area of the makeout spot that our teenage protagonists have decided to visit. The girl is understandably freaked out. The boy wants to throw caution to the wind and continue. Raging teenage hormones, what would we do without them? The girl wins out, and the boy starts the car and goes to drive off. The car has a bit of trouble moving, then pulls out of the makeout spot, and he takes her home. The car has a bit of trouble moving, but then pulls out of the makeout spot, and he takes her home. Once home, the girl apologizes for being jumpy, and they kiss. She gets out of the car and begins to scream. The boy jumps out of the car, runs to her, and sees what she is looking at. He sees a bloody hook hanging from the door of the car. They have narrowly missed being killed by the escape killer. Now, in some versions, the couple hears scraping on the back of the car. In others, the man or woman exit the car to either run away from or to the killer and someone gets killed. Sometimes it's just a couple driving through an unfamiliar part of the country on a trip to somewhere. Regardless of the details, I would argue that most people have heard a version of the story from somewhere in their lives. I did, and it was passed down through oral tradition. I did not read it in a book until much later. Funny thing is, I don't actually remember hearing the story for the first time. It seems as though that this story has always been around and that just kids instinctually know it, absorbed through some sort of cultural osmosis, if you will. The story has been featured in movies in various ways, as well as documentary TV series exploring urban legends and scary stories. I know I saw it years later on a TV show that explored urban legends and tried to trace their origins as well if they were based on any kind of fact. It was a cool show and concept, with recreations of the story and interviews with historians and medical doctors and such, examining accuracy of certain factors, such as the bride that got the discount wedding dress, only to find out that a corpse had been buried in it, and she died as a result of an allergic reaction to formaldehyde. But, I digress. The first instance of the Hook story in print was, of all places, Dear Abby. She printed the story saying that the source didn't know if it was true or not, but was for sure never going to park and make out ever again, and other teenagers should also avoid it. But what if I told you the story was true? Well, sort of. In 1946, Texarkana, Texas, a couple was making out in a lover's lane after seeing a movie. It was just before midnight when a man in a white hood with cut-out eye holes, think Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th Part 2, ordered them out of the car at gunpoint. He intended to rob them, but the boy had no money and was hit over the head and knocked out. The girl was assaulted but survived. A couple of months later, in a different lover's lane, a couple was found shot dead. The murders would continue, and the Texarkana Phantom, as he was dubbed, was never found. About 2 decades later, in the Southern California region, there were again attacks on lovers' lanes, where the couples were robbed and shot sometimes by a masked man. This man, eventually known as the Zodiac Killer, was also never found. These crimes were most likely the origins of this tale, in particular, which in this case were rooted in reality. There is also the origin of the morality angle that would show up in the late 70s and 80s slasher films. As stated in the Scream movies by Randy, if you're a virgin, you will survive the killer as a slasher movie rule. If you abstain from drugs and sex, you are likely to survive the slaughter. Laurie Strode is the restrained one in Halloween. Her friends Annie and Linda, who engage in sex and drugs and lie to their parents, get killed. Although this doesn't quite track, as Laurie smokes weed in Annie's car. This is the general rule of these films. Nancy in the Nightmare on Elm Street films doesn't sleep with Glenn and therefore survives the movie. Countless final girls of the Friday the 13th series are more responsible and conservative when it comes to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and they survive their encounters with Jason, Freddy, Michael, and the rest of the rogues gallery of the slasher world. Freudian analysis of the hook story goes so far as to say the presence of the hook is a phallic symbol. Of course, Freud would say that. Regardless of whether the original intent of the hook story is to symbolize male genitalia, this is a cautionary tale to teenagers. Don't go where you shouldn't go, doing things that you shouldn't do at a young age. The 50s was the rise of the Happy Days-esque teenagers with their fancy cars going on dates. The parents wanted them to save it for marriage. This story exists, in my opinion, to scare kids into straying away from their morals and temptations. I mean, just look at the rise of the slasher films in the 80s and realize that Nancy Reagan's Just Say No to Drugs campaign was going on at the same time as the slasher film was booming. In short, Nancy Reagan and Jason Voorhees do not want you to have sex before marriage and or do drugs. Simple as that. Another story in the collection features a young girl who wakes up with a small blemish on her face. Slightly concerned, she tells her mother, who calms her daughter, saying that it's nothing serious and it should go away. The blemish continues to grow, worrying the daughter. The mother is slightly more concerned, yet still comforting. The blemish continues to grow, and the mother tells the daughter that she will take her to the doctor in the morning. In the middle of the night, the blemish, which has now turned into a large boil, bursts, and dozens of baby spiders cascade down her face. Pretty cool, huh? This is a great example of a different kind of story represented in the Scary Stories collection. Obviously, this is not only a real thing, there are a few kind of bugs in the world that will lay eggs in your skin. American writer and humorist David Sedaris has a story about his partner Hugh where a similar thing happens to him. That book being Me Talk Pretty One Day. But going deeper, the story is really about the human experience of growing and aging. Let's face it, being a human and growing up can be, and often is, a David Cronenberg fever dream of body horror. It starts by losing your teeth, and then you grow another set, you walk around with gaps in your teeth, or half-grown adult teeth poking through your child-sized mouth, then you start to get taller and gangly, or you gain weight or you lose weight, puberty starts, your voice changes. It's gross, uncomfortable, and an awkward time in everybody's life. And this story reflects that in human culture throughout the centuries. It's a story that's relatable, even if you don't have spiders bursting out of your skin. You've gone through or are going through similar experience in growing up. You read this collection and suddenly as a kid, you can relate to the story and the situation. Having something go on with your body that you don't quite understand is very scary. Kids need horror in their lives. Not the horrors of mortgages, murder rates, inflation, geopolitical snafus, or gas prices. But kids need horror. Horrors such as the monster under the bed, or the haunted house a few blocks over, or the legend of saying Bloody Mary in the mirror a number of times at a certain hour. These legends are important to growing up. These horrors are survivable. Eventually, the things that used to scare you when you were 7 or 8, by the time you're 9 or 10, don't bother you. You have survived the fear and terror and found an inner strength over that fear. Now those fears are replaced with new ones. Instead of the dark monster under the bed, by the time you're in middle school, it might be humiliation in front of your peers or being called on in class, and having the focus of the social scene squarely on you. Eventually, these fears ease and are replaced by others. You grow up. You get stronger. You gain confidence. You know that you can survive. Unfortunately, by the time you reach adulthood, the fears and horrors become uncontrollable and more real. Being homeless is a real fear and something much more in the realm of possibility than the thought of a doll coming to life hell-bent on killing you. If I had $1 for every time I wished I had a doll trying to kill me as opposed to paying the mortgage, I would be a rich man. Getting cancer, losing a loved one, etc. We are able to face these fears and battle them as an adult because as children we faced and conquered our fears of monsters and haunted houses. We as a culture and a species need to face controllable and toothless horrors so that we can survive the real ones. When I was a kid in about 3rd grade, I bought Not Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, but a different series aimed at the same market. Super Scary Stories for Sleepovers, and one of the sequels, Even More Super Scary Stories. I most likely bought these at the school book fair. I was unaware that they were a different series that was a ripoff of Alvin Schwartz's 3 collections. At that young and innocent age, I was unfamiliar with duplicitous marketing techniques. Nonetheless, these books looked the same with scary illustrations and even more scary tales lurking inside. I was reading one of them at night that quite frankly scared the shit out of me. I remember it to this day. The story follows 3 friends who decide to go camping and rent a cabin. There is an escape maniac on the loose. Hook story, anybody? But they figure that he won't still be in the area and that there are 3 of them. And they would be able to outnumber him if they ran into him, which they probably won't. Wink, wink. The friends are dropped off and they begin camping. They have fun, the cabin is cool, all is good. Eventually they realize they need more firewood. The friends decide that two should go out to get the firewood just to be safe and to take a flare gun to signal in case of trouble. Our main character watches the two go off into the night. 30 minutes later, just as our main character is getting worried, a flare goes off. He begins to run into the woods and hears the screams of his friends, and runs back into the cabin and begins blocking the door. Soon after, he hears a scratching and a banging at the door. He crawls into a corner and tries to remain as quiet as can be. He eventually falls asleep, which I've always found weird and still do to this day. It happens in horror movies more than you would think. People are horribly traumatized, and then in Friday the 13th movies, they go into a boat into the middle of the lake and fall asleep. It just seems weird. I'm not sure if I lived through that kind of night, I would be able to just fall asleep. I can't fall asleep on a normal day, let's be fair. But after a massacre of some sort, forget about it. Anyway, he is awakened by the panic of a honking horn. It is morning, his ride is here. He frantically unbarricades the door and discovers why the driver has not left the car. The two friends are in front of the cabin door outside with their skulls bashed in. Their fingers are bloody nubs from scratching on the door. It was not the maniac trying to get in, but his friends. The end. Pretty cool, huh? Schwartz unfortunately didn't live long after the Scary Stories books, and did not get to see a lot of their legacy. He got to see the initial calls for bans to the books and allegedly delighted in it. As popularity grew, so did backlash. Irate parents thought these books were disgusting, profane, and inappropriate. In part, the parents were freaked out by the spectacular and dark art of Stephen Gamble. He made illustrations for the cover and the stories in the 3 Scary Stories books, and they are striking black and white macabre images pitch perfect for the collections. Scary Stories was not the only title under fire. R.L. Stine's Goosebumps series and other children's horror novels were also caught in the crossfire. As with today, books are under fire and bathed in negative light by people who most likely had not actually read them. There is plenty of footage from then and now of parents rallying against books with long and lengthy descriptions of how disgusting and immoral they are, only to admit they haven't really read them. I am vehemently against banning books. It is a different discussion on what should be taught. However, I say that books in stores and libraries should be freely available. Honestly, I think it's a minor miracle that in today's age, where we have smartphones, streaming, VR, YouTube, social media, PlayStations, Xboxes, and more, that a kid would want to interact with a book. I leave you with a quote from Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade that perfectly sums up my thoughts about books bans. Morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning them. Act 3, The Mausoleum. It may not be the most expected thing to be watching Are You Afraid of the Dark, a plucky Canadian kids horror show, and seeing some familiar faces. But familiar faces you will see. In the Season 5 episode, The Tale of Station 109.1, a kid finds a radio station meant for the dead, and who was the broadcast DJ on that station, you ask? None other than Gilbert Gottfried, of Problem Child, Aladdin, and stand-up comedy fame. But that's not the only surprise that the Tale of Station 109.1 has. The kid seems familiar because it is a pre-fame Ryan Gosling of The Notebook, Blade Runner 2049, and the Barbie movie. Season 1, Episode 5, Tale of the Hungry Hounds features Mira Kirshner of The L Word, Vampire Diaries, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and Discovery fame. Season 2's opening episode, Tale of the Final Wish, has Bobcat Goldthwait as the Sandman. Bobcat was famous in the Police Academy movies as well as his stand-up. His directorial career is astonishingly underrated, and everyone should at the very least check out World's Greatest Dad, starring Robin Williams in a completely different role than you're used to seeing him in. Season 2 also features Jennifer Irwin in The Tale of Locker 22. You may recognize her from The Goldbergs, horror film The Gate, and many other television shows. That same season sees television favorite Melissa Joan Hart from another 90s iconic Nick show, Clarissa Explains It All, and then eventually Sabrina the Teenage Witch in The Tale of the Frozen Ghost. Jewel State features in The Tale of Watcher's Woods Season 3. You may recognize her from the cult TV show Firefly, The Killing, and Stargate Atlantis. The Riddler himself, Frank Gorshin, shows up in The Tale of the Carved Stone. Extra creepy story, The Tale of the Quicksilver, stars Tatiana Ali, who is at this point also starring in the massively successful Will Smith show, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Rounding out Season 3, we have Neve Campbell, at this time being featured on hit show Party of Five, which would then, of course, lead her to becoming iconic final girl Sidney Prescott in the Scream series. Moving into Season 4, we have Charles S. Dutton in Tale of the Water Demons. You might recognize Charles from Alien 3, Rudy, A Time to Kill, and Gothika, among many others. Tale of the Dead Man's Float has Jay Baruchel as a member of the Midnight Society. Jay was in Almost Famous, voiced the main character in How to Train Your Dragon, as well as television shows and movies such as Undeclared and $1 Million Baby. The Tale of the Chameleons, one of the strangest episodes in the bunch, features not one but two major guest stars, Tia and Tamara Lowry. The twins were stars of major 90s sitcom Sister Sister. The Tale of Prisoners Past features Christopher Castile from Beethoven 1 and 2, popular 90s sitcom Step by Step, as well as fellow Nickelodeon show Hey Arnold as the voice of Eugene. First revival series, Tale of Bigfoot Ridge, has Hayden Christensen, Anakin Skywalker / young Darth Vader himself. This is just a smattering of the number of guest stars and soon-to-be big names that passed through or got their start on Are You Afraid of the Dark? Well, that's our podcast for this week. Be sure to tune in next time for Horror Beneath the Surface. I have been your host, Professor Terror, otherwise known as Mark. Thanks for listening, and pleasant screams. Horror Beneath the Surface is a production of Crooked Rabbit Music, copyright 2024.